Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Craig, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. I did not give you a topic to discuss today, but you're here anyway.
That's right. I've got topics, uh, you know, on the top of my head every day. So,
You're interested in the JFK, Fred Hampton, and RFK assassination, but I have to ask because I don't think I've ever asked you this, but what's your line for conspiracy? Those topics draw in personalities, they draw in certain areas of research, and you have to have some information to really understand what you're, I guess, looking at is real or fake. So I'm curious, what would be your line for conspiracy? Like, what does it open you up to?
as far as a definition of conspiracy or red flags that there was a conspiracy.
More like what could be government manipulation or some things that would get chalked in the bin of like saying that the president was assassinated by the military industrial complex. That's a conspiracy. That's people won't even entertain the discussion. I realized I'm in there, but I also realized I learned more about the Cold War that kind of boosted my knowledge of what was going on back then. Like I'm a lot more knowledgeable than I was a year ago. So I'm curious for you, taking this deep dive, was it the counterculture? Was it the COINTELPRO? Was it the Fred Hampton stuff? What opened you up to understand that your government might not be essentially telling you the truth?
Well, it started with JFK, and just even the broadest reading of the evidence that the government itself presented as, well, here's the proof that Lee Harvey Oswald did it and did it alone. That in and of itself was just completely suspect to me. It resonated in with me that this does not make sense. That if you went to the lengths that the Warren Commission did, and believe me, they did, and then a press that was basically subservient to the current administration, whatever administration that was, it was trusting. The media was trusting in its officials and the stories that they gave. Um, of course, there were investigative journalists, and it's one of the reasons why we had any kind of publicity whatsoever from 1963, from the very beginning of questioning what it was the government. The fact that the Warren Commission began its report with its conclusions, and the conclusion was undeniably that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy, wounded Governor Connolly, and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit alone, unaided by anyone, foreign or domestic. Despite this open and shut case that the government claimed it had against Lee Harvey Oswald, we are going to classify all of the information that led to this conclusion for 75 years. And still to this day, the CIA obviously is the one that we focus on the most, but it's one of the only agencies that still has withheld information about the Kennedy assassination. So that alone, that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty, no conspiracy, open and shut, but we're not going to release any of the information for 75 years. That to me just was, are you kidding me? It's like the LAPD saying with the Robert Kennedy case, that was open and shut. Sirhan alone, unaided. We're not going to even let you read the report itself for 20 years. That in and of itself smacks of not necessarily conspiracy, but responsibility in ferreting out the information that the government wants us to have in these catastrophic historical events.
Well, which agency would you point most at blame? Do you think they all kind of were problems when it comes to the conclusion of the Warren Commission? I mean, we know now, I think that the CIA withheld a lot of information from the Warren Commission, and so did
It still
the
does.
CIA withheld information from the HSCA as well too. After I spoke with Blakey, but was the FBI compliant? Like I was just listening back to my talk with Judge Thunheim, and he said, yeah, when they're declassifying documents for the ARB, the only problems that they had was with the Secret Service, and that was the destruction of documents
The
that
Secret
they
Service or
had.
the CIA?
The Secret Service, he said that was the only one he had problems with, not the CIA. He said CIA was willing and everything. He said the CIA was unorganized.
To put it lightly, absolutely. No, I think all of the intelligence agencies that had anything to add to the JFK assassination investigation were complicit in um, their selectivity of what they showed, to whom they showed it. Because look, intelligence agencies, that's how they operate. It's not it's not just a matter of them looking at a document and saying, "Oh, we're going to share this or we're not going to share this." The FBI in particular had a system that J. Edgar Hoover himself devised of, if we're going to share information, then we're going to put it in this kind of format. So you can look at the kind of document that they have released, and you can tell whether or not this has been stripped down, this has been re-summarized, this has been sanitized, so that it can be sent to either other agencies or anybody else with a public interest in whatever it is the document was about. So all of the agencies had some stake in either covering their ass, covering their mistakes, or sensitive material that they deemed, whether it was justified or not, to be national security concerns. So they were all complicit in not completing the record and not being transparent, um, and being as opaque as they could possibly be. So the FBI, being the Warren Commission's main investigative body, that is, all of the information that or most of the information that the Warren Commission received came through the FBI. So when you have other governmental agencies, especially intelligence agencies, sending the Warren Commission stuff, it's ostensibly going through the FBI, unless of course it's coming through like their contacts, like Alan Dulles, who was the ex-director of the CIA, now one of the members of the Warren Commission investigating his arch enemy, John F. Kennedy. Again, that just red flag, red flag. Um, then that kind of compartmentalization shows itself, as far as the information that's being shared and not being shared. The intelligence agencies back then, um, were fighting for, recognition, their own place in the investigative community, appropriations. They needed money, so all of them wanted to show how indispensable they were. So there was constant infighting between intelligence agencies, which is one of the reasons why it led Kennedy to declare that he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the wind. He wanted to rebuild our intelligence community so that it was more centralized. Um, the name of the CIA, Central Intelligence, again, it showed that there was an attempt to have all of our intelligence agencies pooled and have a central intelligence agency, so that there aren't all of these other competing intelligence agencies, um, you know, crossing territories and infighting, and trying to compete for importance in geopolitical strategies and analytics. So, yeah, so the fact that HISCA had problem, or the Assassination Record Review Board had the most problems with the Secret Service, or the House Select Committee on Assassinations had the most problems with the CIA divulging its information. Again, you can still release information, but you parse it out in a certain way to protect those national security sources. And I get it. If there are methods that you're using to gain this information, that has some merit. But to then completely obliterate all information coming from this source, that's not reasonable. There's a way to, as the FBI has shown, there's a way to release information but protect your sources. My experience with the Fred Hampton's FBI file, which is tens of thousands of pages long. It's the redactions are very, they're frustrating, but some of them I get. So
Do you think it's a cover your ass type thing, in the sense of that they were involved in some matter, or do you think it's a cover your ass in the fact that these agencies care more about their credibility than they do doing the job or whatever they might be, maybe taking their lumps if there were issues. There's obviously problems. The Secret Service has a lot to blame when it comes to Kennedy's death. I think that's why they're so protective over some of their stuff. But these agencies have been running rogue for a long time when it comes on the aspect of being involved in other countries, using reporters in other countries, drugging people without their consent, from prisoners down to even their own military. So I'm curious if it's more about protecting their credibility because there's a whole spider web of things that they're connected to, and each one is a little bit more slimy than the last.
I think there's it's a nice elixir of both of all of those scenarios that you just laid out. I think they had their own asses to cover. I think they did have legitimate um, resources to protect because again, you got, as you said, rogue elements, but even the non-rogue elements, the established elements that basically existed without any checks or balances. That's what you have to remember, is that there was no oversight for the CIA and other intelligence agencies. If there was any oversight, of course, it would have to come from either the president or the NSA. um, but I think at that time, we're still in at the height of the Cold War. Nobody was really questioning what it was the CIA was doing, um, with what money, where they were getting it, um, and like I said, no one to be accountable to for whatever it is they did. It was that implicit trust that, well, the CIA is doing this to protect us and in against the worldwide enemy of communism, so we just have to let them do what they do, and not think twice about it. So I think there is that element, being able to exist and to function without oversight. But then, of course, like you said, they have skin in the game. Their reputations are on the line because the president was, in fact, assassinated under their watch. Um, Certain safety guidelines that are usually in place when a president travels and appears in public were not executed. So the lack of protection, the lack of security um, protocols. Yes, obviously these things are going to make whatever agencies we're talking about look very bad. So they did have their asses to cover, but there's also that um, unexpected element. That is, they didn't expect that something like this, something catastrophic like this, was going to happen. Like the Dallas Police Department, it's a sheriff's office. You know, the municipal and state agencies in Texas didn't expect this, so they're thrown into this whirlwind, this chaotic uh, catastrophe that they did not expect, and so obviously people are gonna be dropping the ball left and right, and so again, it goes back to the protecting your reputation and, well, these things happened, but it wasn't really our fault. It was unexpected, and we were thrown into this impossible situation. Um, but then, of course, there's that other element of, we knew this was going to happen. We allowed it to happen. So we really have to protect that. We really have to protect what it is we knew and when we knew it. Um, and really capitalize on people's innate trust in us to do our jobs and to do it without oversight. So I think all of those elements were into play. But the idea that intelligence agencies, even competing intelligence agencies, somehow could not pull off a conspiracy this big is ludicrous because, well, they exist in secrecy. If they can prevent books from being written, if documents can continue to be withheld, and documents even that are released are so cryptically redacted and excised as to not make any sense. Don't tell me that a conspiracy couldn't exist for this long. It has 60 years, guys.
I don't think you needed every member of the CIA in on the thing, but if you have someone like yeah, if you have someone like Alan Dulles who refuses to divulge information of projects going on that could be potentials for getting Kennedy killed, for instance, I know a lot of people don't think it's the mob. I don't think it is either, but I've been learning more about it based on the HSCA's work. And I know they were kind of focused into blaming it on the mob, but there were things that weren't disclosed to the Warren Commission. They didn't know about the mafia plots against Castro. They also didn't know about Traficante's statements against JFK, the Carlos Marcello statements against JFK, Jimmy Hoffa's statements against JFK, which the HSA all proved all had potential means for pulling off the assassination. The point was the Warren Commission was not included in that conversation, and only one member on that board had a bunch more information than the other, and that was Alan Dulles.
Right. But this goes back to the whole channeling information through the FBI, its main investigative body. J. Edgar Hoover himself said that there was no mafia. So you've got the head of the FBI who's now leading the investigation into Kennedy's assassination and saying there is no mafia, so there's nothing to investigate. So he wasn't going to put any resources of the FBI into that slant, even if there were connections directly tying the mafia to certain aspects of the JFK case. All leads should have been followed. And in fact, the FBI, the Warren Commission declared that they did. You know, in their prologue about how many witnesses they talk to, how many pages of documents they have, and you know, to emphasize how large the investigation was, so that you'd be lulled to sleep by the enormity of their investigation, the parameters of the enormity of their investigation. You don't look into the details, and that was one of them.
How many witnesses were interviewed by the Warren Commission? Was it 488 or was it 513?
That's an excellent question. Because the Warren Commission never bothered to tabulate any of that.
They did 93 meetings.
Well, you're talking about testimony in front of the Warren Commission, and I can't remember who did that tabulation, but you've got the funny thing is it, well, actually, I don't know if it was Hiska that brought it out. I think Hiska was the one that actually laid out the makeup of the Warren Commission in front of witnesses. That is, I think that there were only, if I remember correctly, it's something very minimal, very small number of witnesses who gave their testimony in front of all 7 members of the Warren Commission. Think of the Warren Commission as this revolving door of attentiveness. They all had jobs to do. That is, the Warren Commission was not their full-time job. Most of the work that was done by the Warren Commission was done by its staffers, right?
It's a secondary committee of lawyers.
Right. They're assistant counsels. Absolutely. The Warren Commission as a whole rarely were ever there as a body to listen to any testimony or expert witnesses to the assassination. So it may have started, that is, one witness may have taken the stand and maybe 6 members of the Warren Commission were there, but as the testimony went on, they kept going in and out. So it went from 6 to 3 to 1 to 2 to 5, you know, just constantly in and out. It was, don't think of the Warren Commission as this body that sat dutifully in front of all of the witnesses and all of the exhibits and expert testimony, scientific testimony that was taken. It was very much a revolving door of people who could be bothered to listen to this and not be bothered to listen to this.
Does this sound similar? But it's 552 witnesses that they took testimony from. The commission did. No member of the commission ever heard testimony from more than 13% of the witnesses. At no time were any or all the members of the commission involved in one witness's testimony. Earl Warren heard 71 witnesses with 12.8%. Gerald Ford heard 70 witnesses with 12.6%. Alan Dulles heard 60 witnesses with 10.9%. John Sherman Cooper heard 50 witnesses with 9%. John McCloy heard 35 witnesses with 6.3%. Hale Boggs heard 20 witnesses with 3.6%. And Richard Russell heard 6 witnesses with only 1%.
So yes, so that is from Hiska, going back and what the time cards of the Warren Commission members, and that's absolutely right. But when you're talking about witnesses, we're not necessarily talking about eyewitnesses. We're talking about any witnesses, like.
Well, how much? What's the discrepancy between, obviously eyes is seeing it and then hearing it is ear witnesses? But like, is there a percentage difference between? I thought they would just all be witnesses to the assassination. They don't just get lumped in the same pile.
They do get lumped in the same pile. Okay. James Humes, who conducted the autopsy on President Kennedy, one of the 3, but he was the commander who conducted the autopsy on Kennedy. He was a witness. and he testified. So of
Well,
course, all the Warren Commission members are going to be there at that time. But he's a witness. Damn it, he's a witness. So,
which
but
which
not an eyewitness. So we're not talking just about the eyewitnesses who were in Dealey Plaza. We're talking about witnesses that appeared before the Warren Commission, whether they had expert testimony. Shit, I think even J. Edgar Hoover was a witness who testified. So,
well, how did you get attracted to the witnesses in the first place so you could be able to make your book and map?
well, it started obviously as not obviously. It started uh, almost by necessity. I was doing lectures at the time. Um, and I needed a visual because this was long before your time, Robbie, where we
I'm
were still
46.
yeah, right. Um, we, we were still using slides, you know. There
I
there
had a
were
projector in school. I know.
right. So uh, and a slide is fine, but if you're doing a slide show, you don't want to have to keep going back to an aerial photograph of Dealey Plaza to talk about where the motorcade went and where these witnesses were and what they said. So an architect friend of mine plotted the buildings on Dealey Plaza in the streets, and it was huge. It was like 6 feet by 9 feet. So I had to make it into a triptych. It was just huge, 3 pieces. That's what a triptych is. Uh, and was using this as a visual, and that was incredibly helpful in being able to talk about elements of the motorcade and the witnesses. And because when you say that a witness was standing here and heard this, and you compare it with another witness who's standing next to them, and they're either the same or they're different, it just really helps to have a visual to just all just very conveniently be able to point to the map and say that. So as that was successful, I thought to myself, well, how about if I plot some of the most important witnesses, like where Abraham Zapruder was standing, on the North Pergola, and the witnesses in front of the Texas School Book Depository who said, no, shots didn't come from our building. They came from that building, or they came from the knoll. So then it just started snowballing into that. Josiah Thompson, in his book 6 Seconds in Dallas, he had a little condensed map with some of the most important witnesses. And I guess that was really my inspiration to then take the huge map that I already had and said, look, let me do all of the witnesses I can find. Let's plot all of the witnesses, all of the cars in the street, so that people can have a visual as to how far apart they were or what order they were in. As photographers who were pretty far back in the motorcade came upon the scene of Dealey Plaza, started jumping out of their cars and taking photographs and films, and then jumping back into the car to go to Parkland. I mean, the whole ballet was really fascinating to see and to consider. So then I said, okay, I'm going to go through the records that I could find, and I'm going to try to find as many witnesses as I can. And my first attempt was 273 witnesses. But then with the advent, as you know, because this whole project has taken 15 years, or took 15 years, because I started selling my schematic and my book in 1991, and it had 273 witnesses. But then I started redoing everything, and that took 15 years. So that when I relaunched it in 2010, I was up to 393 witnesses. 93, 95, almost 400 witnesses I was up to, because with the advent of internet digitizing things, I was able to find record groups that I did not have access to in 1991 when I first started. So that's why there was such a jump in how many witnesses. The sixth floor museum, which is in the Texas School Book Depository, they had been doing oral histories since 1990 or 1981. And so they were calling on people who were in Dealey Plaza or who had anything to do with JFK's visit to come and give their oral testimony or oral histories. And so I found like an additional 27 witnesses that were there, but had never given a statement to one of the investigative agencies or bodies. Um, so I added those to the list and to my book as well. So it was out of necessity that I did this project, but also out of no one had done this before. No one had made a database of as many witnesses as you could find. So you had asked me how many witnesses did the Warren Commission listen to or take statements from. Um, that's hard to say because the Warren Commission never said how many witnesses they listened to. And when I say witnesses, I mean eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza. The House Select Committee assassination said there was actually a task force led by Joseph Bastieri. He declared that there were 692 people present in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. Now, Bastieri never said how he arrived at this number, and it wasn't footnoted. So when he declared that, he didn't say what is he basing this on. Did Hiska go back through the Warren Commission records? Did Hiska find these witnesses themselves and then come to the 692 witnesses? I have no idea. So that's the only number that I've ever seen, as far as calculating how many witnesses from Dealey Plaza there were. For all I know, Bastieri did what we should have done years ago, and that is all the photographs that we have and films. You count how many people are there, because if you looked at all of the photographs, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of professional and amateur photographs from Dealey Plaza, we could probably count the heads. Even though we can't identify who those people are, we could probably count the heads, and maybe that's how he came up with the 692. But if he took 692 statements from witnesses, I would be floored. And as you know, the supplemental report released by Hiska about the eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza, it's only 25 pages long. They don't allude to hundreds of witnesses like that they talk to.
No, they pull out a couple. I don't necessarily think that's the necessity of cherry picking, though. I just think that there's probably a lot of people that have dissent, and if you work for the government, you're not going to want to keep going and trying to log every single one person with dissent. That's what's the problem with it being an investigation. I mean, if it's a 25-page thing, and you have 600 something people that might be saying something completely different. I mean, we know that there was a 70 something people that I've heard before that saw smoke coming from the knoll and ran towards the knoll. So that we should see at least 70 something pages or more of those witnesses and trying to track them down as well too.
Absolutely. So that's what I was attempting to do, or continue to attempt to do, because I don't feel that my work is the end all be all. It's exhaustive, but it's not comprehensive. I always thought of this as a work in progress. That is, we will always find new witnesses. We will always find, like, even a grandchild will be going through their grandparents' attic or garage and stumble across something and then release it. It was a diary, and we have excerpts from that day. Holy shit, my grandparents were in
Minuteman.
right. They were in Dealey Plaza at the time. And those kind of finds are easier to assess because the witness themselves didn't come forward. So they can't be called into question as far as their motive is concerned. Well, why did you wait so long? Well, they didn't wait so long. It was discovered upon their death, and so if there's a present recollection that was preserved in, say, a journal or that any kind of document like that, that holds a lot more weight than somebody coming forward and then being accused of just wanting notoriety. Like, especially during the 60th anniversary, do not be surprised if you look at the newspapers all around the country, if someone hasn't come forward and said, I was there, but this is the first time that I've ever talked about it. And for legitimate reasons. I mean, it's not just because they want notoriety necessarily, but I can completely understand how people were completely freaked out by the events that took place in Dealey Plaza, and had been reading throughout the years. And I'm not talking about through 60 years, I'm talking about through the first 7 years after the assassination, of witnesses and their mysterious deaths not wanting to come forward.
What's your view on Paul Landis coming out?
I have a certain reverence for the Secret Service, uh, despite the fact that they were incredibly careless and to a certain extent they were culpable in President Kennedy's assassination. I'm not saying they were part of the conspiracy. I'm saying that they were culpable because of their behavior in the 24 hours prior to doing it.
Rooftops should have been searched and checked that were not checked. There should have been a Secret Service officer on that car, which, if you listen to Sam Kinney, stated that Kennedy was not in charge if there was going to be a Secret Service on that car or not. That would be Roy Kellerman. And Kellerman's also, I think it's Kellerman, or I might be getting the name wrong, but there might be someone else that changed the route. Whoever was in, yeah, whoever was in charge of the route was the one that told them that they want Secret Service on the car. And when Vince Palomara interviewed Sam Kinney said Kennedy was not a part of Secret Service going on the car or not. And that's when you see the guy throw his hands up.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because Kennedy was incredibly vain and wanted people to see not just him, but his Jackie. He knew that Jackie was people were coming out to see her as much, if not more, than him. But he wanted to be seen, which is why he didn't want the bubble. Um, and it wasn't a bulletproof bubble, so, and he knew that. So, but it just would have been very difficult to spot him through a sniper's lens. Anyway, um, yes, a lot of Secret Service protocols that had already been in place were not followed. Um, the most egregious of which was the steep 120-degree turn from Houston Street onto Elm Street, which slowed the car down considerably. That's a huge no-no. But I'm talking about the drinking the night before of Secret Service agents, and that kind of thing. But I still have, like I said, I still have a certain reverence for them because of the guilt they must have felt. Certainly the ones in the follow-up car, the ones that were on the running board, uh, specifically Clint Hill and Paul Landis. Um, because they're the only two that I'm aware of that have actually written memoirs, and the only two that I'm aware of that actually showed contrition, that actually showed, I mean, Clint Hill and fighting his demons for 60 years.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that. Um,
No, I get that they all probably have their own perspective and viewpoint on what went on, and their accounts may vary wildly. It's just interesting where you see the lines start to connect, like when they tried to identify CE 399, and they're talking about the person that handed to them. Nobody could positively identify if it was the same bullet that they saw, and that's their statement. That's in the Warren Commission, which I feel like the Warren Commission, if you talk about a cover up, they just wouldn't include it. But I just think their whole culpability is the fact they never pursued the leads, where
that's
things didn't add up.
that's a very important point, and one of that just is replete in my book about the eyewitnesses.
Hopefully, you send me a copy.
I will. It's not just what the eyewitnesses said; it's what they didn't say. Why didn't they say it? Because they weren't asked. Especially when you're talking about agencies like the Secret Service, they are not trained to volunteer stuff, either in their written statement or in testimony. As a matter of fact, the FBI specifically, were trained by J. Edgar Hoover under his model of an intelligence agency to be as non-revealing as possible, even under oath, even in their own statements. So it's not like they're going to volunteer information. So if Paul Landis is writing his report, he is only going to give those elements that he believes through his training and through his own conscience, that
Did you
are
ever read Landis's report?
absolutely. And
It's very, very detailed to the point where I felt like he was making some of it up. I'm not saying he was involved in any way of the thing. The way he was saying he was surveilling and looking at every rooftop and everything like that. I'm like, bro, that's like when someone catches me on my phone at the job. That's the excuse I give.
well,
Like,
fair enough, but I think a lot of Secret Service agents, even though they weren't detailed to do that, or they weren't supplemented by military intelligence groups or any kind of military, they weren't supplemented by that. Maybe that's one of the reasons why they were looking up at rooftops and windows. First of all, it was obvious. They are driving through a concentrated downtown area, and you can just see it. Even just going from left to right, you can see all the open windows. You can see people hanging out. You can see signs. So it makes sense to me that Landis would now reveal, or even back then in his statements, which were kind of consistent. He only gave two reports. One of them ended at 4 a.m. on Saturday the 23rd, but um, he had more responsibilities past that. So the fact that it ended at 4 o'clock as opposed to the whole weekend, he had responsibilities. Anyway, if he says that while he's on the running board, he's looking up and he's checking out windows and rooftops, he could have absolutely been doing that. With the knowledge that, yeah, okay, we don't have Army intelligence up there. We don't have people on the ground, stationary people on the ground looking at buildings and open windows and things like that. So he could have done that as part of his job, without, of course, knowing what was going to happen or being complicit in the lack of security. I'm just saying it's not beyond reasonability that Secret Service agents would have been scanning the rooftops. I don't know what they would have done if they saw something suspicious. It was kind of difficult because they're traveling at 15, 20 miles an hour through these very dense streets. Sometimes they're 4 or 5 people deep on the sidewalks. And you talk about Secret Service agents wanting to be on President Kennedy's car. They were. You can see photographs that when they really slowed down to make turns because so many people were in the streets or impeding the progress of the motorcade, Clint Hill and quite possibly John Reddy, who was in front of Landis on the right-hand running board, got off the car and got onto the presidential limousine, held onto the handrails as they were going through the turn. So there were a couple of times that the Secret Service agents were, in fact, on President Kennedy's car. It's just they weren't stationed there for the entire motorcade.
Well, some were on the trip from or protecting or guarding at Love Field, and then others were already meeting for the Dow Texmart as well too.
Right, much like the Dallas police and Dallas sheriffs, those who were given assignments for crowd control or to keep the crowds back so the motorcade could pass through, they had different assignments at different times during the motorcade. You know,
But most of the Secret Service talked about seeing Kennedy's right side of his head explode, which I think is interesting because that's not what we see through different depictions and photographs.
absolutely, or even the physics described by the Warren Commission vis-a-vis the FBI of why or what the significance of that was.
Why do you think it wasn't 217 or you said 273 of the Zapruder film where Connolly gets hit? You don't think the same bullet? I mean, obviously you don't think the same bullet, but why don't you think he wasn't hit until later?
I don't know if I actually subscribe to the interpretation by Dr. Cheryl Wecht that at 273, Connolly is completely turned around and looking at Kennedy. And you can see the cuff of his right hand because it's holding his Stetson hat and he's pinned against the car because the man's 6'4", and he's in a jump seat. So he's very cramped, and you can see his right hand, and you can see the cuff of his shirt. That there was no blood on it. That's what Dr. Weck said. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. It's the fact that he is completely upright and he is completely turned and looking directly at President Kennedy. And this is a split second before the headshot. So a man whose bones have been broken and whose lung has collapsed, I don't think would have the poise to be able to sit straight up and to turn around and look directly at President Kennedy. And it's as he's turning back around that you see him react. That is, to falling back, his mouth is open, obviously in pain, and then the headshot. So my interpretation of what I see in this Zapruder film and his movements, they do not show a man who has been shot through his chest, through his wrist, until 273. About that. And had I known you'd be asking me about that, I would have brought up the Zapruder film or the still and shown it to you. I mean, I still could.
I remembered that from the first time we were talking about it and heard you mention it. Uh, I have to ask, what do you, I sent you a thing of the HSCA and the witnesses that they interviewed. And the first one, obviously we talked a little bit about it off air, but I'm interested, how did you choose which witnesses you felt like were most important to include in your book, or at least different opinions on that? Now, like I said, it's a 25-page report. They didn't interview. We know the HSCA is a problem there. They didn't. They did get a couple names just to show that there was people, but I feel like if you're displaying that out there, and if anybody's still interested in the assassination, if you see just 25 pages, you're going to be like, okay, that's cool. But imagine if you had all 600 and something, and then next thing you know, you're able to actually really get people on board with you about like, oh yeah, there's a lot more than just 25 people that said something different.
Well, the report that you sent me, like I said, it's a supplemental report. It's 25 pages, and but its purpose is in its title, Dealey Plaza Conspiracy Witnesses. So I think that I read it years ago. It obviously I read it in order to prepare my book. It's been a while, so I don't really recall all of the witnesses that they focused on, but they are obviously focusing on debunking conspiracy theories. So it's a very selected number of witnesses that they highlight because they want to show discredit these witnesses. That's essentially what they're doing with this supplemental report. So the table of contents. Let me see here. Presence of two men in the upper floor windows of the Texas School Book Depository, presence of possible gunmen on the grassy knoll, accounts of persons fleeing from the Texas School Book Depository, fleeing from Dealey Plaza, accounts of bullets hitting Plaza area, accounts of smoke in Dealey Plaza at the time of the shots. Now, all of that seems very comprehensive, but its whole purpose is to debunk these, not support or show that there were uh, a substantial number of eyewitnesses that made all these claims. In fact, I know that through my work on the eyewitnesses, that some of the newest eyewitnesses, that is, the eyewitnesses that were whose oral histories were taken by the sixth floor museum, they were also eyewitnesses to the smoke on the knoll, or bullets hitting the ground, or people fleeing in certain direction that were never part of the record. Um, I have serious doubts as to whether Hiska went through or were given all of the eyewitness statements that were taken by the FBI. The FBI didn't just take one of each witness. Sometimes they took multiple statements from witnesses and put them in different places, compiled them, and those compendia were made part of certain exhibits that the Warren Commission used. So, because of all of the ways in which intelligence documents were presented to the Warren Commission and the Warren Commission published them, a lot of these statements could have gotten lost or never disclosed. So I challenge and question Hiska's thoroughness when it comes to the very eyewitnesses that they use to debunk any of these conspiracy theories about um, stray bullets, smoke, and people leaving Dealey Plaza in a suspicious way. Of course, we know that Hiska tried to identify the Umbrella Man, but never the dark complected man who was standing next to him, who raised his hand.
Could I ask you about those? Because those are areas I've never touched because they've been kind of controversial.
And they
Um,
and they have they still to this day.
Bashuka lady too.
The Babushka lady, right?
Babushka.
As far as who that woman was, Beverly Oliver came forward and claimed that she was the Babushka lady, but I think that's been pretty convincingly debunked. So her identity is still up in the air. Um, but she was important because it seems that she was filming from the opposite side of Abraham Zapruder, and that would have been incredibly important to have had. Obviously, film from the south side. Um, Hiska did not do a good job in establishing that. Was it Stephen Louis Witt or Louis Stephen Witt? I can never remember. His name was Witt, Witt, and I believe either I think he came forward. I don't know if they identified him and then found him and brought him forward. But he testified, and it's completely unconvincing to me. He brought an umbrella that he thinks was the umbrella that he had on November 22nd, 1963. But of course, Hiska was using that to a certain degree to again debunk the conspiracy theory. At that point, we're talking 1978. The Flechette theory that the CIA had, in fact, by that time, constructed as one of their little 007 gadgets a umbrella that could fire darts
Yeah.
from it, and that could have been the source of the entrance wound that the Parkland doctors described, to paralyze or to otherwise immobilize President Kennedy to keep him upright and for a kill shot. So they asked Witt to open up his umbrella and turn it, and some people ducked and they laughed about it, and that kind of thing. So uh, it was more to debunk the conspiracy theory than it was to establish that, hey, this
But
was.
does it have more weight because the CIA did have a heart attack gun? I'm not saying it's what happened and there was an umbrella gun, but I'm saying, I mean, now, like I said, when I question your line of conspiracy, I mean, I'm finding a lot of things I used to laugh and scoff at a little bit
A
more
lot of
like,
people, yeah, but no, it lends credence because that shit really did exist. That's exactly what the CIA did. I mean, how is that any more preposterous than the fact that the CIA spent, you know, $250,000 to buy LSD to give to their agents just to see what would happen? It is no more preposterous that
well, leads to the death of Frank Olson.
building these weapons, or no matter how preposterous they sound, um, yeah, that was kind of part of what the CIA was all about.
Now, I think the HSCA, I actually probably just I look at them for some answers on some things because I actually think they did a really good job despite being limited in so many resources and maybe having an agenda. Like I said, when I spoke to Blakey, he was handshaked by whoever the director was at the time. I'm blanking on his name,
Director
but
of the FBI,
director of
CIA,
whoever put together the HSCA or came to Blakey.
right? But no, he shook hands with the director of who?
That's who I'm talking about. Somebody who was trying to set up the HSCA. I don't remember his name. I'm going to remember it later.
Okay, all
Okay.
right.
But when he shook his hand and told him, I want you to maintain the reputation of these people as if they were alive, and you send that into someone who's doing an investigation, you're going to have a skewed thought of like not wanting to dig into some of the more scandalous ideas of them. And when we talk about the HSCA, I think the path of least resistance for them that Blakey found was pointing more directly at the mob. I mean, we eventually started finding out that the mob was trafficking guns and doing a bunch of things with Cuban operations. There's just I've seen the church committee bring it up a couple of times, but the problem with Wilson Hughes, John Wilson, I think his name is, might be wrong on that. The guy who said he saw Traficante and Ruby in Castro's prison. Well, there was another one. There was Lewis McWillie, who said he was in locked up in there with Lauren Hall. And that yeah, guy Ruby did come and visit Traficante and they, talked or whatever. So I mean, that wasn't chased down. But then I think even the HSCA talks about how this British investigative journalist that claimed to see Ruby there was called crazy or psychopathic, but it turns out even they didn't even believe the mob when the mob were all saying, yeah, Ruby definitely visited down there. And nobody even bothered to open up Ruby's connection. So they did explore that angle, the HSCA did, which I think is really important. But I also think that's the path of least resistance. The CIA is not going to want to, hinder anything if it's just going more towards the mob angle. It's going off on like kind of the wrong route, which I said, I don't think the mob did it. But I think if we look at what we have been shown that is different and more knowledgeable on that area of that climate, which is the mob connection when it comes to dealings with the CIA and the FBI.
Yeah. Hiska's concern wasn't to pick up where the church committee left off. It was trying to make a connection between the mafia and the CIA. Like you said, the path of least resistance was a mafia-driven conspiracy. You're absolutely right. They couldn't have done it, but Blakey and his staff, or even his directive to his staff, were going to follow the mafia angle. Um, yeah, that was the path of least resistance. You got to remember that Blakey was not, or Stokes, Louis Stokes.
That's who told him that to keep the reputation as if they were alive. Stokes told him that.
Right. These were not the first choices for the chair of HISCA. When it was first devised after the church committee had discovered all these revelations about the FBI, the CIA, so forth and so on, and how that connects to not only the JFK assassination, but also the Martin Luther King assassination, which is why they decided to look at these two assassinations as a congressional investigation. The original chair was supposed to be Richard Sprague, who was a JFK researcher, impeccable qualifications and a CV. He was ousted because one of the reasons was because he was committed to do a thorough investigation and follow all leads, and so he wanted a lot more money appropriation for that investigation, and he had set up task forces to look at all aspects of the Kennedy assassination, and he was not going to classify any of the documents that they discovered or that they were able to obtain from their own resources. So the fact that an impartial, complete, full investigation was thwarted from the very beginning to put Stokes and Blakey in place. That's why they came up with the T-shirts. The HISCA staff came up with T-shirts that said "The truth is irrelevant," because that's the line that you were just talking about. How we need to protect reputations of individuals and of institutions at the expense of the truth. And that's what HISCA's mantra was throughout their investigation. So you take it with a grain of salt. Again,
Was it the HSCA or the church committee that was looking into mysterious deaths that started happening around the time of the assassination? Even during the HSCA's time, there became a number of witnesses that started having some mysterious incidences. Roger Craig is one of them when the HSCA was going to interview him.
yeah, I mean, already to that point, when HISCA came about in 77, 78, 79, there had already been uh, dozens of witnesses that had already mysteriously lost their lives. I mean, just look at the Garrison investigation in 69, 67, 68, 69. Just that alone is enough to warrant suspicion as far as the demise of these very important witnesses that could have made Garrison's case and not made him sound so much like a nut. But I don't know that HISCA specifically dealt with the mysterious deaths of witnesses. But I do not claim to be an expert on HISCA or its findings.
Nobody's an expert on HISCA. Nobody researches HISCA for some reason.
Well, probably because of the skepticism about it. But then again, we can say the same thing about the Warren Commission, and we're all experts on the Warren Commission because that's what you start with. But I think that based on what the Warren Commission did, HISCA did,
even Bert Griffith, who thinks it was talks about there's not a conspiracy, but also thinks that there's some issues with the mob. He even stated in HSCA testimony that if we would have known about the mafia plots against Castro, that would have given them new directions to head in towards, which is a lot.
They did know.
Bert Griffith claimed that in an interview.
But what I'm saying is the church committee had already been released by then. They already knew what the CIA was capable of and what they had already done. They already established the record. So as far as the mafia, yeah, they already knew it. J. Edgar Hoover was long dead by that time, so there was no more sacred institutional cow saying that the mafia doesn't exist. We know what they do. We know what they've done, and that the CIA has used them on various occasions to do its bidding. So that shouldn't have been a surprise. But I think that we need to remember, you mentioned it very briefly, the Assassination Record and Review Board uh, is more of an important investigative body, and it wasn't even an investigative body. I'm sorry to have used that term. Um, that was more important than the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Their mandate was to oversee the transfer of documents from various intelligence agencies, the Warren Commission and HISCA, to the National Archives per the Kennedy Act, which was signed into law by the first George Bush, George W.H. Bush, um, Herbert Walker Bush, H.W., not W.H. Anyway, you remember it's the morning. This is probably.
No, I know.
Um, but what I think a lot of people overlook or don't know, your viewers and other people who are dabble in the Kennedy assassination, is that even though they didn't do investigations, the ARB did in fact interview people when there were gaps in what the Warren Commission said and what HISCA said, and there were gaps in it. People that came forward um, during its tenure, they took wonderful interviews
Yeah.
of many people who had not been heard before or who hadn't been heard from enough.
Tom
And
Samoluk is a person I spoke with on my show, who's in charge of with the ARB, and he told a crazy story. But I guess someone at the agency wanted him to destroy files on either, I think it was David Atlee Phillips or something of that sort, and that person happened to throw those documents in his trunk and drive into his house where it sat in a garage for 20 something years until Tom Samoluk came across it. But technically, the guy said, since it's not an active case, the Kennedy case has an answer to it, even though it was never fully closed by the Warren Commission. It's not an active case. That means these documents are no longer relevant, and they wanted to destroy them.
yeah, isn't that a great line? Yeah, it was a closed case, no longer relevant, even though uh, the historical significance is unmatched in recent history. But yeah, so they took the statements, interviews, um, deep dive interviews with a lot of witnesses having to do with medical evidence, ballistics evidence, like you said, the original investigations, and based on those alone, I believe that those warrant a new investigation into President Kennedy's assassination.
Do you think that someone should investigate more of the connection between Gerald Ford, why he was giving information? I don't remember if it was to the FBI or to the CIA, but Gerald Ford was on the not on the warrant. Was he on the Warren Commission? Yeah, he was giving information to the FBI or the CIA about what was going on the Warren Commission.
Yeah, I can't really speak to that. I've read that before, and that kind of behavior in and of itself is suspicious. Why he's the go-to guy. He was a congressman from Michigan. He wasn't, did he have ties to the intelligence agencies? Was he an underling of Allen Dulles? I don't know, but the fact that yeah, he was feeding information from any intelligence, or that he was the go-between.
Well, how much do you base a lot of this stuff on time? Like time being the revealer of all this? Because if we look at like back then, the testimony of Earl Cabell, who we know was feeding information to the CIA or was a CIA asset in some sense. But if you look at his testimony from either the House Select Committee on Assassinations, I think, maybe,
Okay.
I don't think it's
Well,
the Warren
he did
Commission.
testify to both bodies. He did to both the Warren Commission and the HISCA.
I can,
I
I,
just don't recall the extent of his testimony.
I can actually read it because I think like I
Now,
said,
you're talking about Earl Cabell,
Earl
not his,
Cabell, yeah.
not his brother Charles, who was the deputy director of the CIA, whom Kennedy fired after the Bay of Pigs.
No, it was Earl
Earl
Cabell.
Cabell, the mayor of Dallas.
Yeah, Earl Cabell. It's on History Matters. I'm pretty sure it's white paper, so I'm pretty sure it's the HSCA. The Warren Commission ones are all in yellow or some tanned
Oh,
ones.
all right.
But it says to Mr. Cabell, but it's Mr. Hubert. Says now during the period November 22nd until the shooting of Oswald, did you have any conversations with the press concerning the whole matter? Mr. Cabell, there was a number of calls. There were members of the press, both the national and international press, that came to my home during that period. I had given a statement on Friday night to both television stations. That was by blank. That was on Friday. On television, yes. Do you recall whether any part of those statements or interviews had to do with the transfer of Oswald? None whatsoever. Now, they could have asked him if he was claiming that Oswald was the lone shooter, which he did do the day of. He was claiming that Oswald, the lone assassin, has been caught and giving plenty of news repress. Now, you, as a Dallas police person, you could just say, trying to support saying, yeah, we got the guy who killed the president and get all the attention so it looks good for you and get in front of the whole thing. But they did not acknowledge his whole even right here where it says there was one that Mr. Cabell says there was one that was rumored. One of our local weekly publications made that as a statement. That is completely false. At no time did I ever have any contact with Chief Curry to the extent that I gave him any orders, instructions, or make any comment upon the situation other than the context when I had mentioned the reference in the proposed torchlight or no, yeah, proposed torchlight parade. Do you know of any pressure put upon him by anyone in the authority over him? I do not know of any, and my assumption will be, I say assumption, will be that none have been made because I know Mr. Cruel operates to the extent that he would not interfere in the duties of the chief of police. Now, I'm sure that they had conversations with reference to security and that sort of thing. They're basically talking about to what extent did Chief Curry give any orders, instructions, or make any comments upon the situation other than contact with why there was a number of police people that didn't stand down and didn't go towards the parade. You know, that's there. He was asking about Curry about that, but Cabell had lied twice in that interview. And we know that because then later we talk about him being a CIA asset. Well, I have the document that shows that, and it's a secret agreement where it literally says the third one here says, I solemnly pledge my word that I will never divulge, publish, nor reveal either word or conduct by any other means, any information or knowledge so indicted above, unless specifically authorized to by the U.S. government. Signed, Earl Cabell. So
Authorized by the US government. Yep. Uh-huh.
so when you look at like all the stuff about his confidential relationship between myself and the US government, I will be the recipient of information which in itself has implications to be I can't read that because the word is blanked out or the way they scan it's weird. But they were talking about the realize of collecting and using information as well as the identity of persons involved as a secret as a subset of information itself and therefore must not be treated by with equal degree of secrecy. So there's a bunch in this contract where like this is his thing signed for the CIA talking about not divulging secrets and having this relationship with the US government that was eventually proved later. But it goes back to my question about time. Sorry for reading all that. Won't do that again.
Not at all. Not at
But
all.
if you go into yeah, time has shown now that when us like for instance, when I had a guest on like Mal Hyman, when I was talking to him and he mentions Earl Cabell being a US agent or agent of the CIA based on relationships of his brother being the mayor or something of that sort, or having CIA connections, then I go and find the document that his name is signed on it that didn't get exposed until 15 years after the HSCA or
Exactly.
10 years after the HSCA.
Exactly. No, Earl was the one who was the mayor of Dallas. His brother Charles was the one who was the deputy director of the CIA, whom Kennedy fired. So right there, there's a
For
conflict
the
of
Bay of
interest.
Pigs, right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
right there, there's a conflict of interest. Mayor Cabell should not have been involved in any kind of intelligence or information gathering, disseminating, or middleman having to do anything to do with this assassination. There was such a conflict of interest, much like Dulles. But of course, at that time, you trusted your the people who ran these institutions. You trusted these men that they were honorable, they were doing their job. So even a declarative statement like that wouldn't have raised many eyebrows to the general public because yeah, he was fulfilling his duty and his, and we're going to trust what he says or what he does. Um,
How much does this destroy credibility of agencies in the long run of things if you really examine it from them trying to protect their credibility? But even the massive amount of names on the Warren Commission is basically a star-studded cast of people that weren't even involved in the assassination or in the investigation. You know, they were just there as like, hey, here's my nameplate. You got my name signed on. It's like signing a peer-reviewed article. It doesn't mean they necessarily agree.
Absolutely, or that they read it, yeah, or that they knew what was being written in their name, yeah. Which, of course, we can say about the general public and the Warren Commission. Um, that this was the investigation that was done on our behalf for us, and this is the best you can do. So yeah, it's the credibility. Quite frankly, it wasn't just one thing; it was several things. So we just didn't realize it in '63 and '64 that was the most glaring example of complicity and what should have been completely that should have decimated our intelligence agencies. The fact that it happened, the fact that they covered it up, the fact that they ostensibly uh, had skin in the game. Um, then, as the '60s went on, and more transparency was being demanded, that uh, peaked in '74 with Nixon and Watergate, and then of course in '75 with the Church Committee, exposing what our intelligence agencies were even capable of and documenting that. Um, there should have just been a complete uh, eradication or restructuring of our intelligence and its transparency, its stated uh, mandate to the people. Are you working for the people of the United States, or are you working for yourselves? So their credibility, in my mind, was completely shot. It's kind of like, and this may be a horrible comparison, but during the O.J. Simpson trial in 93, 90,
Damn.
um,
I still want to speak to that, man. I got to ask about Naked Gun.
you could.
He
There's
does
plenty.
not do interviews at all.
There's plenty there, but I was rooting against rooting for no other reason that was sufficient. My reason was sufficient that I wanted to see him acquitted because it reflected poorly on the LAPD. And given what the LAPD had done, obviously with Rodney King, but a few years earlier with Robert Kennedy, that's when it should have started. The assassination of Robert Kennedy and the LAPD's handling of that should have there should have been consequences, and there wasn't. And the consequences came later, obviously with Rodney King and then O.J. Simpson. They dropped the ball in '68. Why shouldn't they drop the ball in '93 and '94? So I was very glad that he was acquitted because they did such a piss poor job. And that again, that should have been a house clearing event. That should have been a when you talk about the integrity of our police agencies, that they can be militarized. They can buy tanks and anti riot gear and former military hardware, but they can't get an investigation right. They can't transfer a blood sample from a point A to point B without fucking it up. Well, then guess what? O.J. Simpson deserves to be acquitted if they can't do their job,
Why
and
do
they
you
could.
when do you think the people started losing faith in the media? And do you think if it was earlier when the Warren Commission happened, then we probably would have had more dissenters from the official narrative? I mean, obviously, a large percentage of the public did not agree with the Warren Commission's conclusions, but the ability or lack of interest to carry on through the HSEA's investigation and subsequent investigations that did expose a lot. When do you think the media line started to become the joke is now that nobody trusts anything the media says, but it was not like that back in the day. Walter Cronkite was like Oprah. He was the passionate person that gave you the news and you agreed with everything that he said. And Dan Rather was a voice of reason. And then now, in this basis of time, we've learned a lot more about those people to say that that is utterly false. But nobody really had any dissent from their media or their government back then. Even during the Vietnam War, a lot of people agreed or just didn't lack of interest of what was going on in Vietnam. It wasn't until later on when more information got exposed, you realized we shouldn't have been over there.
Well, let's not paint too broad of a brush about the media back then, as far as their willingness to toe the official line. Uh, I mean, look,
Started with movies when J. Edgar Hoover started going in there and the DOD started influencing. If you ever know the story about that, the one guy, Lawrence Suey is his name. He was a film historian. And he had all these, the government was giving him all the documents about movies that they were influencing. And he just kept them privately in his home. And then he released them to the archives in a private collection. So when people would go and try and get those documents, he would just be like, no. And it wasn't until he died that they realized what they, I had Matt on here. He's a friend of mine, but he made a documentary called Theaters of War, and it was exposed all in 2019 about like Godzilla's influence, the moral message behind Godzilla, but the massive amount of scripts and money that was getting funded into movies like Lone Survivor, Fast and Furious, Marvel franchises, Battleship is a good example. And it was all in this guy's private collection. And whenever someone would just call up like, hey, can I borrow this out of your archive? He'd just be like, no. No connections, just a film historian, but the government realized that this guy would be great as an asset rather than an enemy and got him on board.
absolutely. The government recruited people like that all the time, and even in the media, unfortunately. Um, the FBI, most specifically, had contacts in the media. But like I said, let's not paint too broad of a brush with the media. Yes, they in large part, like the American public, trusted their institutions, trusted the people who ran those institutions. We had not yet had Watergate. We had not yet had a reason to question the integrity and dignity of either the people who ran the agencies or the agencies as a collective. But the eventual turning of the public's opinion about President Kennedy's assassination to one of conspiracy, to one of Oswald didn't do it, was gradual. It wasn't immediate. And in large part, it was because of the media, independent media as well. Because in the 1960s, we're talking about the just the revolution of underground magazine and independent press. And they did an excellent job in giving platforms to people like Mark Lane and to Sylvia Maher and to even Harold Weisberg, um, Vincent Salandria, a lot of magazines and otherwise scholarly magazines who gave platform to these voices, these dissenting voices. And so the media did gradually woke up along with the public, one feeding off of the other. But you asked, when did that change? When did that start changing? The trusting of our journalists. Um,
God, you're making me want a cigarette right now, dude. I keep seeing that smoke come out of the corner. I'm like, fuck.
all right, but you're vaping. That should do it.
It doesn't work. It's not the same.
Um,
I want a good
we
old menthol 100. Just ah,
I can't condone it, but I can't deny it.
a lucky strike. I'll take a lucky strike, and those are brutal on the fucking lungs. I'll tell you that much.
But your dad's lucky strike certainly did. My dad smoked unfiltered Camels.
Damn.
Ain't smoked those. Um, but the media was also responsible in bringing the horror and the truth about the Vietnam War to the American public, and I think that really is what stoked a lot of the anti-war resistance. And then, of course, even Watergate. I mean, when you're talking about journalism, it played an absolutely pivotal role in bringing this awareness of the capability and culpability of our institutions and even a presidential administration to the forefront. So they did even though we have criticisms like the New York Times. The New York Times, seemingly being a sounding board for the Warren Commission, publishing their conclusions even before the report was released. I thought that was a really smarmy thing to do. The fact that Time Life bought the Zapruder film and would not let anyone see it, that was also a smarmy thing to do and led to a boycott on my part, Time Life. But despite all of those shortcomings, for the most part, the media did a fabulous job in informing uh, people about these developments concerning the government concerning investigations, and the tragedies that they were ostensibly supposed to investigate. I think where it turned, where it changed, when we no longer trusted the media, is with the starting of the media conglomerations, when the monopolies started uh, happening in the 1980s and 1990s, when big corporations were buying up media, and consolidating the media. That's when it turned, and now it's just non-existent. When you've got 7 or 8 monoliths controlling now 80-90% of all of our media. And the media itself has changed, but I'm saying even newspapers that still exist or magazines that still exist, when you will have a handful of conglomerates who own all of that, the TV stations, radio stations, and print media, that's when you know that there are not going to be editors like Ben Bradley or the Luces or anybody who we think of as media moguls back in the day in the 60s and 70s. It just can't exist anymore. So that's, I think, where people, and now that everybody uh, can have an online, what would you call it? It's not a newspaper anymore, but online media. Um, I think that just lends itself to people not trusting what it is that they're reading.
Well, how much, I know you said the JFK assassination kind of started it off for you, but how much did you already know about certain Cold War context to better understand the discussion of what was going on during the Kennedy assassination research?
That's an excellent question, and I did have.
Thanks, man. I'm trying my best.
That's why you have such an impeccable reputation.
Oh,
You're good
God.
questions, because I think that's important. Any kind of any historical um, event, catastrophic or in its importance in U.S. history, needs to have that context. And it was one of the themes of the movie JFK, Oliver Stone's JFK, that I think was overlooked and overshadowed by all of the nitpicky fucking criticism of the media. You want to talk about somebody who was lambasted in the media, it was Oliver Stone and his film.
Well, none of the criticisms were against the film. It was against his character.
Well, it was against the film.
I don't know. I saw a lot of people calling him a communist.
Oh, sure, and he is, but what the hell does that mean? No, no context. If you're calling somebody a communist, there's no context in it. But it was important. One of the points, one of the important points of that film is that nobody asked, and the composite character of Mr. X, played by Donald Sutherland, it was a perfect um, summary of what that attitude should have been. Ruby, Oswald, the mafia, all of this were just parlor games. It kept us from asking the important question: who would have wanted him dead? Who had the power to cover it up? You know, we're talking about context. Besides Lee Harvey Oswald, whom the Warren Commission or House Select Committee on Assassinations could not pin a motive to. It was the only one of our 4 presidential assassinations that could not have a political um, angle to it. That is, the other 3 political assassinations, there were political reasons for what they did. This was the only one that didn't have a political reason. Um, and despite that, um, who else besides Lee Harvey Oswald, according to the government, would have wanted him dead? And that's what the context we're talking about. The fact that even if you look at Oswald and the mystique behind him, um, he's in the Marines in the late 1950s, and he's being trained in the Russian language. His nickname in the Marines was right. At the height of the Cold War, the Marines, of all people, of all groups, would not have thought it cute that this guy was a professed Marxist and would have treated him like some mascot to make fun of. They would have beaten the living shit out of him. He would have been brought up on charges you know, of treason. If people really believed that he was a Marxist, a full blown card carrying Marxist. No, he was being trained in the Russian language and towing this line for a reason. So that context was very important. Um, and the fact that, of course, JFK himself was naive and um, trusting in our institutions over the Bay of Pigs, which led to a very public embarrassment, but a very private indignation towards the CIA and towards the military, which is why then Kennedy turned not to his military advisors or uh, directors of certain intelligence agencies, but his own inner circle, very tight, very small inner circle that now was going to inform the rest of his administration. That was incredibly um, um, unsettling for his advisors, his military advisors, and his intelligence advisors. The fact that he learned his lesson very quickly, but unfortunately had to do it very publicly over the Bay of Pigs. So again, context is very important. So when I started reading about the Kennedy assassination, it wasn't just about the medical aspects or the ballistics aspects or even the investigative aspects, but of course the historical context. In that, who would have wanted him dead? Who could have made that happen?
Do you know anything about Bobby Kennedy and what he was doing with some of this materials of JFK, like the brain, things of that sort that all get chalked up to Bobby Kennedy got rid of it or something of that sort?
Did I because we've done a lot of podcasts, and so you'll forgive me if I repeat myself, but did I ever share with you my theory about that?
No, you never even sent me your book.
You never sent me your address. And you're moving now, so you better be the right address. Anyway, um I talked about
Can't believe
how
you
the
just said I was moving on air. How dare you? People are going to find me.
I didn't say where you were moving.
That's true. Good.
Um you're going to Canada. Um I said before that the Assassination Record Review Board did such a good job, even though their mandate wasn't investigative, but the materials that they came up with, the interviews that they conducted, warrants a new investigation. I will trust no investigation unless it starts with the exhumation of President Kennedy's body. That may seem insensitive, that may seem gaudy or gauche. It is not. President Kennedy has yet to have a full medical legal autopsy. His accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, has already had two impeccable medical legal autopsies that cannot be disputed. If we exhume President Kennedy's body, we will see whether or not my theory is right. And I to my dying day, I will believe this to be the case. After the autopsy was completed, after most of the medical evidence had been already been gathered, cataloged ostensibly, it was gathered all together and given to the Secret Service. The Secret Service then gives it to the Kennedy family, specifically Mrs. Kennedy. She's not going to do anything with it. So Robert Kennedy was the caretaker of the trunk that contained all of the medical evidence in the case. In 1966, Mrs. Kennedy decides to will the materials back to the National Archives with the codicil that no one be allowed to see any of this for 5 years, 5 years, and only then they have to get permission from Admiral Berkeley to be able to see these materials. And it was I can't remember his first name now. John Latimer was the first doctor, because he was not a pathologist, but he's a urologist. He was the first to see the autopsy photographs. But prior to all of that, when Mrs. Kennedy transferred the autopsy materials to the National Archives, they had to be inventoried. So they brought back James Humes, Thornton Boswell, and Pierre Fink, the three gentlemen who did the autopsy, to inventory all of the information, to inventory all of the materials. It was then that it was discovered that some of the materials were missing. Specifically, President Kennedy's fixed in formalin brain was missing. Slides of the interior of President Kennedy's chest were missing, and photographs of the interior of President Kennedy's chest when the organs had been removed. These were the materials that were missing. Oh well, no investigation, no holy shit, where are they? The questioning of the Kennedy family, because they were still being treated with way too much reverence, as far as I'm concerned. So it was a mystery. 1967, in I believe it was April, President Kennedy's grave was moved from its original site. I don't know if it was 20 feet, if it was 50 feet. The claim is that the cement enclosure that held his coffin had cracked and water was getting in it.
Oh, like Lincoln, and the floor was sinking.
Exactly. Now, how they knew that, I have no clue. But okay, so they dig it up and they move it. They reset it in a new, what would you call it? The
Grave plot.
Yeah. And guess who was there overseeing it? Robert Kennedy. I believe that Robert Kennedy took those materials, those autopsy materials, and put them in the safest place he knew. Because when Robert Kennedy then became president, he would have the essential medical information that he needed to start a new investigation. Now, how are those essential? Well, President Kennedy's brain obviously is important because, like gelatin, it would show how many bullets went through his head and from what direction. The slides of, and I misspoke when I told you the slides were from the interior of his chest. No, the slides were of the margins of the entrance and exit wounds. What that will show is how much burning took place around the margins of the wound, which gives you an indication of how far the gun was away from the body at the time that he was struck. Then the photographs of the interior of his chest with the organs removed would have shown whether or not the wound in the back actually penetrated and went through. So all of these things obviously established by the Warren Commission, the single bullet theory, the bullet from the back to the front, right to left, blah, 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 established by the brain, it could be re-examined and well, officially and professionally be assessed by pathologists to see, in fact, if one, two, or even three bullets went through his head. So that's my theory, is that Robert Kennedy took those materials, buried them again with his brother in 1967, so that when he became president, whether it was going to be 68, 72, I don't know, I don't care, he would have those materials to be able to launch a new investigation.
Wouldn't he back it up, though, in case he knew if he was going to be next for making statements about opening up the next investigation?
Wouldn't he back what up?
Any of the materials that he has access to about what he was looking for when it came to Kennedy, that would prove conspiracy or prove someone from inside his own organization took care of him.
I wouldn't doubt that, but I don't know where that would have taken place or how that, where those would have been kept. But
start hitting the drywall in the Kennedy home.
Absolutely. Yeah, in McLean, Virginia, wherever else he resided, sure. Yeah. Hyannisport, whoever owns the Kennedy compound now. But of course that would look, if we can't get a Texas judge to order the exhumation of President Kennedy, we're not going to get obviously a judge to say, yeah, let's rip apart all the houses and look for these things.
How important would it be to exhume Connolly? I know
Uh,
his wife didn't want that, but
and you know what? I again this reverence for the Conleys and the Kennedys, more so for the Kennedys than the Conleys. Do I think that Nellie Conley was part of the conspiracy? Absolutely not.
no, but I don't think she wanted her husband dug up.
She didn't need to dig him up. She was asked if before he was buried, could we please remove the rest of the fragments that are still in your husband's wrist? It would be minimally evasive. He could have been buried with an open casket. It's not like they were digging through his head or his chest or anything like that. They simply wanted to remove the pieces that were still left because you take those fragments from his wrist and the fragments that were removed in 1963. You weigh them. If they weigh more than what's missing from Commission Exhibits 399 or the Magic Bullet, it is disproven immediately. And the entirety of the Warren Commission, it's 900 pages of its report and supplemental 26 volumes. It all goes to shit because they based everything on that one theory that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, and he couldn't have done it alone if there wasn't a single bullet theory. So no single bullet theory means a second shooter at least, which means conspiracy, which the Warren Commission wrote all of that and published all of that to prove that it was not a conspiracy, that Lee Harvey Oswald did it and did it alone. If medically, scientifically, ballistically, it could be proven in an instant that it couldn't have been, that it was impossible, everything falls away. And it's exposed. It's finally exposed. I think we've already done that, but I'm just saying, you can't walk that one back. If she had let that take place, you couldn't have walked that one back. There would be no excuse for, wow, all of the metal that was taken from his wrist weighs more than what's missing from that bullet. You can't, you know. So then all of the questions of what did you know when you knew it? Why did you lie about it all this time? It comes into play and people would have to answer it. And that would be a lot more embarrassing than finding a document from 60 years ago or longer ago that says, yeah, a plot to kill the president was put into the works and it was followed through with. So yes, I think it would be important, but now it's a lot more complicated. If Nellie Connolly had just let it take place prior to his being buried, it would be a lot less invasive than having to dig him up now and desecrate his body. So it nobody's fault but Nellie's, because she could have complied right from the beginning.
Simple yes or no would have sufficed. God damn. No, I'm kidding. That was great.
No, that's perfect. Absolutely. Yeah. Why can't you just simple yes or no?
Um,
Yep.
Craig, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I know we didn't have a direction for this one. But I really do appreciate you giving me the time and going a little bit more in depth on some things. But is there a place where people can find your links, even if your site's not up entirely yet, but you have the link for it?
Yes, I've told your listeners and several times before that I was going to put something up having to do with Fred Hampton, the deputy chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. I did buy the domain. It's fredhampton.blog. I have not, unfortunately, put anything up yet, but you were kind enough to offer to put up at least the links to your podcast on that website. So all I can do is ask your watchers and listeners to check back to fredhampton.blog often, and there will be material up there soon.
I'm going to link your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode Out of the Blank Pod.